Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be perfectly frank with you. There's only one story worthwhile talking today because it's a really big one. It's a doozy, if you will. And this is the news story that the State Department in the US has issued a report around the human rights practices in South Africa. And I've got to be honest and say, report's really not good reading. In any case, before we get on to the main video, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. You know the drill, guys. Just hit the bell icon. In any case, we have to start this off by saying that News 24 in their fact-checking desk have issued two articles, and these articles are important, and we'll see why in a minute. But the first one was around expropriation without compensation, where apparently the owners sold some land privately for 80 million. Now, the news ombudsman recently determined that this was fake, and that actually News 24 had got the story wrong. So it's amazing that when they fact-check, they get the story wrong. In any case, they also did another news story, another fact check, if you want to call it that. And these were around the AfriForum farm murder cases. And this was following Trump and Ramaphosa's meeting in the United States, where apparently the allegations of genocide to farmers was obviously raised as a contentious issue. So, with that being said, how fact-checking worthy was that fact-checking by News 24? Well, according to the State Department's report, now this is the State Department's 2024 Country Report on Human Rights Practices South Africa, released on August 12th, 2025, so basically yesterday. Now, the first thing you're probably going to want to know is what exactly is this report? Well, the report itself is an assessment of human rights practices in, well, any country that it's looking at, and in this instance, South Africa. And it's for the year 2024. So obviously they take some time to do some contextual reporting, collate evidence, and then they submit it forward. Now, the main assessment headlines, if you will, is that they identify significant human rights issues in South Africa, which includes arbitrary or unlawful killings, that will be your farm murders, and arbitrary arrest or detention or other abuses. Now, they have noted that local coverage, that means our local news, notes that the reports portray a worsening human rights environment, and South Africa's government rejects the report as inaccurate or deeply flawed. So they already know that in the news, we already talk about how there's all this crime that goes on, murders and so forth, and they know that the South African government basically just buries its head in the sand and ignores it. Now, the report further goes on to say that in relation to unlawful or arbitrary killings and abuses by security forces, they have concerns over impunity and lack of any form of accountability despite oversight bodies. And yes, we know this to be true. There are forms of killings that occur. We've got the political killings issue that has occurred right now. We've got the KZN police commissioner who implicated the police commissioner for trying to cover up supposedly, allegedly, politically motivated killings. So we know that this is true. We know that accountability in South Africa is, well, virtually non-existent. This isn't news to anybody. Now, they then flagged that prison conditions were overcrowded and sometimes harsh, with risks from violence or poor infrastructure, and that whilst independent monitoring was allowed, there was very little remediation if it ever occurred. So even where abuses in the prison system are identified, nobody ever does anything. And this is one of the biggest challenges Peter Controversies has had by taking over correctional services. Now, in relation to civil liberties, they identify that the freedom of expression or media generally respected the law and practice, but that journalists and whistleblowers can face intimidation or violence from criminal networks or corrupt officials, and protection of these individuals remains inconsistent. This is very true. Whistleblowers in South Africa do not have a good time. As we've seen in the Tembisa hospital, if you're a whistleblower, you generally get assassinated. There's recently been an instance in Nelson Mandela Bay where a prosecutor was killed outside of her home. Now, in relation to freedom of assembly/association, whilst this is considered to be lawful, they do note that there are occasionally police excesses and sporadic violence around protests are noted in monitoring. And this is very true. Many of our protests do turn violent, especially if they're with the EFF. And when it comes through to the police, sometimes the police are very heavy-handed. We saw this in the COVID era, where many of the police were very heavy-handed on some of the white protesters against there, but When it came through to clicks and other such instances, well, the police were very lax. So you may say that this indicates forms of, well, selective justice. Now, when it comes through to the rule of law and corruption, in terms of the independent judiciary, they do note that it is independent from their perspective, but they say that there are significant case backlogs and that this undermines timely justice. And I'd say if you've ever interacted with the court system, you know exactly how significantly delayed they are. Quite frequently, you cannot lodge paperwork with many of the courts because, well, the infrastructure's aged, things don't work very well, and as a result, typically just you don't get a good service. Now, when it comes to corruption in terms of the rule of law, this remains a serious problem at multiple levels of government, with prosecutions continuing to be, well, what they say kind of lax. And quite often the reason for that is because of what they term as capacity constraints. Now, we know this to be true because let's look at the case of Julius Malema. How many cases of Julius Malema just get delayed and delayed and delayed, and then he doesn't pitch and he's sick? Jacob Zuma himself, how many times has his case been delayed and delayed and delayed? So this ultimately, the Stalingrad strategy, so famous in South Africa, means that justice, well, rarely is delayed. And quite often the next date for the case is quite far into the future because capacity constraints. So this is 100% correct. Now, when it comes through to discrimination, they highlight gender-based violence and femicide, which they say is pervasive despite active government and civil society efforts. And one would have to ask at some point whether this potentially, allegedly, could potentially be cultural, because we know that Ramaphosa frequently addresses this issue. He frequently talks about it. And there are numerous bodies in place to offer forms of protection, but there is no real protection ultimately given. And one may ask, why? And so you may be tempted to say, possibly it's cultural. Who knows? Now, when it comes through to xenophobic violence and harassment, specifically the targeting of foreign nationals, they note that the protection responses are uneven. And there is a reason for that, and that's because you'll know that many political parties actually, this is their key issue. This is their key issue that they use as a voting platform, such as Action SA, such as the PA, Operation Dudula. Yeah, this is kind of a normal thing. Now, the report further goes on to say that there are concerns around the LGBTIQ plus discrimination and episodic violence, with legal protection stronger, but enforcement on the ground being weaker. And this is basically them saying that, again, there's lots of like lip service that goes on to the LGBT community, but ultimately when it comes through to law enforcement, well, that's kind of another story entirely, because as we know, law enforcement in South Africa is just not very good. Now, moving on to the labor protection. So they note that laws protect organizing or collective bargaining, and in terms of South Africa, this is a constitutionally protected issue. But the report cites that violence or intimidation around strikes in certain sectors and in the informal sector causes vulnerability, specifically in terms of wage theft, unsafe work environments, and so forth. Now, if you want proof of this, all you have to do is every year watch the negotiations between the government and the civil service. Watch Eskom negotiate its pay rises with its employees. And if you want to see how fast those turn violent, municipal wage negotiations frequently turn violent, with a number of situations where you can highlight around the country where the municipal buildings themselves have been set on fire due to these negotiations and the intimidation that occurs around those sectors. Now, in terms of the political context, the report notes that South Africa remains a multi-party constitutional democracy, and this year, well, the time the report was written, there was what they classed as a competitive election and coalition negotiations, which they classed as being dynamic. But they do continue and say that there does remain concerns around public sector integrity and service delivery, because as we know, our public service in South Africa is, well, a joke. Now, when it came through to some of the contested points, well, the biggest one was around property rights concerns, specifically following the expropriation bill, which, as you know, Pretoria says we're not wholesale confiscating all the land. But there is still the ability to do that. And there are political parties, such as the MK party, that are still advocating for the wholesale confiscation of all land, the custodianship of it within the state's ambit. Now, they've also noted that there are certain, shall we say, laws in place that may come across as discriminatory, such as the licensing criteria, third wave BE, and so forth. Now, all of this, as you can imagine, is contested by South Africa because South Africa doesn't actually like the report. And so in response, Durko, yes, Dango's Durko, Islamistan Durko, issued a statement, a media statement on the same day, the 12th of August, and the media statement says that they reject the US State Department's 2024 South African Human Rights Report as, and I quote, inaccurate and deeply flawed. Now, the claim that they're making is that the American report relies on acontextual information and discredited accounts that misrepresent South Africa's constitutional reality. But I myself, just off the top of my head, referring to all of the points issued, pretty much can highlight and cite any one of these issues and say, here's actual instances of it occurring. But Durko gives its own examples. They say, a case involving the death of farm workers is, per Durko, wrongly framed as extrajudicial killings while the matter is still before the court. So what they're effectively saying is that one of the cases that highlights extrajudicial killings, well, that hasn't actually finalized to the court system, so it's a bit too soon to say that it was an extrajudicial killing. Now, Durko claims that calling it as such is premature and a distortion of the facts. In terms of the policing allegations, Durko cites that incidents of police use of force are mentioned without, according to Durko, acknowledging that there is active oversight and investigations by constitutionally mandated bodies. No, that's not the point, Durko. In fact, quite the reverse. The US says that there are bodies, but nothing ever gets done. No one ever gets held accountable, and this is factual. Now, in terms of South Africa's position, well, according to Durko, South Africa emphasizes a transparent system with Chapter 9 institutions which safeguard human rights. And they say it's ironic for the US, given its own rights concerns, to issue a one-sided report. Well, Durko, if you really have an issue with the US, why don't you issue your own human rights report around, I don't know, concerns that are occurring in the US? I'd love to see it. In any case, in terms of the Expropriation Act, Durko says that, well, the Human Rights Office assessment of the Land Expropriation Act praised it as a critical step to addressing land historical inequality, framing this as evidence of rights-based reform. And so, according to Durko, well, the allegation that the Expropriation Act is a deprivation of property rights is, well, not factual. Even though that's exactly what expropriation does, but if you actually look at the definition of theft, it is the unlawful taking of another's property without their consent with the intention to permanently deprive them of it. Now, all you're doing here is you're changing the definition of unlawful to now lawful. It's still theft, isn't it? Because it's still the deprivation of somebody's property without their consent with the intention to permanently deprive them of it. Theft by any way. I mean, you can just dress this up in whatever rights, inequality, redress language that you want, but it's still theft, isn't it? So what's next? Well, Durko says that they will release a document pack to set the record straight. And they will link the South African Human Rights Court, the Kangaroo Court, and the UN Human Rights Court reports, and AFP, BSP, and BBC pieces, which they say will show that there are distortions in the US report and that this will correct it. But I've got to say, this isn't really how you address this, is it? The United States is constantly putting South Africa under pressure for it basically being a socialist shithole. And it is a socialist shithole. It has been this way for some time. Name for me one issue in South Africa that has improved under the ANC. And I don't care who you are, name it. And you can't. Because under Cyril Ramaphosa's regime, the entire country has gone to shit. No one can say otherwise. And this is borne out in everybody's normal day-to-day experience or living experience. If I think about it from my own personal perspective, all the lovely little promises that the ANC said at the dawn of democracy have proven to be false. In fact, I'm reminded that on May the 10th, 1994, Nelson Mandela said in his inauguration speech, "Never, never, never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another and suffer the indignity of being the skunk of the world." But Afrikaners are frequently considered the skunk of South Africa, with many forms of legislation being put in place in order to repress that nation. Whites in South Africa frequently get targeted in political rhetoric by political parties who choose to be populist. We've seen this time and time again. In fact, I'm reminded of the Mousepruit Pool incident where, on the 8th of January 2023, during the ANC's 111th anniversary conference, Cyril Ramaphosa, and I quote, said, "Don't fear white people, their time has passed, and they no longer have power. Their apartheid is gone. Stay strong, young men." This isn't how you foster relationships, do you? It feels almost like you're coming out there and targeting an ethnic minority. But in any case, I'm sure the government would dispute this. All of the claims, they said that don't worry, in the new South Africa, you would be a normal bog-standard citizen of the state like everyone else. Tell that to any Jewish community. Let's see the Jewish community go protest with the ANC anywhere. Let's see how long it takes them to be singled out because of, I don't know, Palestinian issues. Let's go see any individual go to any of the ANC addresses. Let's go see them even in the public addresses and go try champion a white cause, saying something like, don't take our property, don't take us out of a job, and watch how quick it is until the majority parties tell them to shut up and go sit in a corner. And when challenged and you say, well, you shouldn't really be dismissing us, they'll say, yes, but we're the majority and this is our country, you bloody foreigners. I mean, there's tons of examples of this. Like, just spend half an hour on Twitter and you'll find it. So how the ANC has the gall to sit there and write propaganda pieces going, oh, the US has got it wrong, I'll never know. Anyway, do let me know what you think of this report in the comments section below. Until next time, bye.